So today, I wanted to do something completely different. The chapter was a fine chapter, and the two authors did an amazing job covering an incredible amount of stuff and making a very good case for what they thought about how fear was driving, white fear specifically was driving all this. But I don't want to deal with all of that white fear. I want to deal with this white fear. What is the fear that we hold, continue to hold? What keeps us bound into patterns? And why is it that fear is such a powerful motivator for us? Why is it that we let fear drive so much of our actions? And I don't mean they're fearful and they do stuff, but our fear of them, whoever they are. Why is it that fear is so powerful that way? And I guess the follow-up is, and why does it take on such a negative spin on a regular basis? Why is that where we take it? So let's start just with this. Just a basic definition of what do you think fear is?
This is Deborah, and I'm waving at the screen. The opposite of love, or acting in love.
I think that's a good way to be able to look at it. If love is that choice of relationship towards another person, fear is that which chooses not to have relationship, drives us in a different direction.
Something that you would be afraid of, that you're afraid for yourself, your body, or
Safety.
weakness, or
Yeah. So something that you perceive as a threat to mind, body, spirit, whatever it happens to be, society. Right. Yeah, that's what fear is.
And fear is a human reaction. It's the limbic system taking immediate charge. And if you're walking in the desert and you hear a rattlesnake, or if you're bicycling down the road and you see a car turn in front of you, fear is a productive response. It's when we get stuck in the fear.
Yeah.
Or particularly when empire uses fear.
Yeah. And Ron, let me just elaborate on one of the things you said, that fear is a normal part of who we are. But in America, I don't think that is the message at all about fear. In America, we wear the t-shirts that say no fear, and we try to live as if we take it as a badge of honor that I'm not afraid of anything. And so we're denying that basic part of our systems that are trying to say that there's things to be afraid of. And so we think that fear is only a negative that we shouldn't have any association with. And I think just that action itself puts us in a bad relationship towards fear. Anyone else? What is fear?
everybody has their own fears too. What you might be afraid of, maybe I'm not afraid of, but you know, Ron was talking about having a snake.
Yeah.
You know, I would go on the other side of the room in order to stay away from the snake.
And part of what you'd want to examine is why is it that happened in you? What kind of stories were told? What kind of experiences were had? What went on that in you that fear developed versus some other fear? Right.
I mean, I'm from an area of Wisconsin where there are no poisonous snakes anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you gotta go probably.
Except for the state legislature.
Well,
there are some there.
yes.
Yeah.
So there's no rational, maybe because I wasn't afraid of him. Introduced to poison snakes or something. Well, I heard about them, there were, in the west part of the state, there were smart, poison snakes around. But
Rivers, yeah.
I never saw them.
So
So-
sometimes it's the unfamiliarity.
Yeah.
It's that this thing is somewhere outside of your range of experience.
Right, and you better be as afraid of them.
Yeah, yeah. So there's something that Joyce is admitting to. How about the rest of us? What, and be really honest here. Don't be afraid to admit. What is it that you're afraid of?
Well, I would say that fear is a natural response, like to a loud noise.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
I mean, sometimes we're protected. Are you guys hearing an echo?
I can't hear an echo. I can hear you. Good.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's echoing to me. It's bugging me. But anyway, I was just thinking about, the times that, like, a fear of COVID caused me to change my behavior in a million ways.
Yeah,
I started wearing masks out in public, not something I would ever do. I wore them in places where there were crowds. There were all sorts of behaviors I changed because I was afraid of it.
yeah.
So I don't see fear as something so terrible. There's times when it protects us and we act prudently.
Yeah, but at the same time as that happened, there were people who would say you were taking undue steps of fear, and fear was a negative from their perspective of how you were reacting to COVID. And so we have different spaces of how we react to the very same phenomena. Right? What else are you afraid of? Anybody else?
Financial lack.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And right now, with the cost of everything going high, that's a legitimate fear to have, isn't it?
Climate change.
Yeah, climate change.
Fear of the unknown and
Yeah.
fear of that which I can't control.
I know Melissa is not speaking because her biggest fear happens to be in the office next to hers, and she doesn't want to say that.
I'm afraid of falling.
Yeah, and as we grow more, I mean, as we advance in age, that is a more true fear to have.
And I fell on the outside
Mm,
once,
mhm, mhm.
and she has helped me because I can't go up curves. And I'm always looking
Yeah.
for where the concrete's just level,
Mhm.
because I'm afraid that I'll take that step up
Yeah,
or step down and break something.
yeah,
But it affects my whole life
yeah,
because of that.
yeah. And it's not an unfounded fear, but it can really take you to some dark places, can't it?
Yes, it can.
Yeah, yeah. I worry about what can take us to very dark places right now, and that's our political climate, right? Everything that we're doing right now reminds me a lot of the early 1500s, the Reformation time. Catholic and Protestant broke off into two churches, and you know what the immediate effect of that Reformation was?
Death. 4.
Yeah, 30 years of war that killed a third of the people in Europe.
Mhm.
And it takes almost no imagination on my part to see us going down that very same road.
Yeah.
And I'm really afraid of that.
I am too. I've been reading stuff about what Russia's doing.
It's not Russia I'm afraid of.
China.
It is the United States of America that I'm afraid of.
Yeah.
Actions within our own country. I'm not afraid of Russia or China. They might sweep in and pick up the bits of. I'm afraid of what we are going to do to ourselves. which may have effects globally.
Mhm. We have met the enemy, and he is us.
And he is us. So, fear, it's something that we should face. The problem is how do we get past all the tendencies to say, don't show your fear at all? Because there's a lot of messaging that says that, isn't there? And that's driving much of American culture, I think. And not in a good way. The two main ways that we've been taught to deal with fear is flight or fight, right? Snake shows up in front of you, you run away from the snake, right? Or you take the shovel in your hand and you cut off the head of the snake. You know, you destroy the thing that makes you afraid, right? There's wisdom in both those. Sometimes you do have to cut off the head of the snake to protect yourself. Sometimes you run away from it to keep yourself out of danger, right? But neither of those really solves the issue of fear when it comes right down to it, right? Because sooner or later, you run across another snake and you got to decide again, what do you do?
Oh,
Rural Metro.
Marcher.
Uh-huh.
I can't say it.
Yeah. So what is, and that's the hard part to figure out is what do we do to actually solve fear, not take care of its symptoms?
Well, but can we solve fear or can we just let it go? So for instance, and I'm getting better with mindfulness meditation, but like if I'm bicycling and a car pulls out in front of me and I have to slam on and after the adrenaline stops, you get back to normal. It's when you get stuck in those stories or when you do what I've done before, which is yell a bit. It's just letting the fear happen and then let it go.
That's right.
And then when we get into stories about race and other things, that's different. It's being able to, I guess, see that we're being manipulated through fear and not get caught up in the story.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think you're dealing exactly right with it. Because oftentimes fear comes from spaces that are outside of our control, right? In whatever way, most of us would not choose on a regular basis to go meet a rattlesnake. That wouldn't be on our agenda, at least a rattlesnake that wasn't behind plexiglass or so, where we were safe. It's when all of a sudden it shows up on the path we're walking on. We wouldn't choose to run into a car, but suddenly it turns in our way. And what do? That's a legitimate fear to be able to have. What do we do in those situations? How do we solve them? The one thing I know, for example, if you're afraid of snakes, let's not even talk about rattlesnakes, because rattlesnakes are different, because you don't just walk up to them and say, how are you? Let me pet you and I'll make you better. Right? That's when you get bit and die, right? But we also have, because of the potential danger of some snakes, we get this fear of all snakes. And, sometimes a trembling fear. And you know how they solve that? People that are trying to help you deal with that fear?
Desensitization.
Yeah, I was going to say there's exposure therapy.
That's right, exposure therapy. They move you towards, ultimately to where you touch. They try to keep you safe and where you feel still safe, but you have to move towards to really deal with the fear, which is against our first response. If we're moving towards it, it is in a threatening way towards whatever that is, right? That's the fight part of things. It is not in a let me calm my fear about it way. But when we do that fight thing and we beat it up and we take it down, then we think we've taken care of our fear. But have we really?
No, I think in that situation, you just feed your fear.
Yeah, and we feed our ego around it, saying, oh, I can take care of it, I'm not afraid any longer. But the reality is maybe that snake was not dangerous, but the next one is. And so what do we do? So that the next time we don't run in and be in a dangerous situation, so that we have a healthy relationship too. And we recognize this kind of snake versus that kind of snake. It's really complicated because our first instinct is not to do what I think takes care of the fear. Either flight or fight moves the fear further away, but doesn't deal with the fear itself. Right? And if I look at this chapter, early Americans, I think the big fear was we can't lose our economy. It is what's driving us. It's what's giving us the ability to be able to live, establish a country, break off from England, all those empowering things. And so they, and I mean both North and South, didn't deal with it. Their fear, they just ignored the things, and they let slavery become more and more endemic to what they had to have, what they were as a country. And we're still dealing with the after effects of that, right? How do we do a third option? And what exactly does that third option look like?
Face the fear.
Face the fear.
Or assess each situation, because it looks like as I was reading the chapter, that it was like they built upon built upon built, because this happened, then we have to do this. And instead of looking at each situation differently, they went back to the extreme, just suppress it, just wipe it out. And then that eventually led to a place, I think, where it came to fight, literally.
Right. Right. And black enslaved people were also facing this as well. And their response was to break out violently, which in some ways is an appropriate response, but breaking out violently also doesn't completely solve the issue. Obviously, in that case, it often meant that not just the 150 people who were involved in the rebellion, but another 150 to set a precedence, right? That, you know, don't go down this road at all. And so it actually made the situation in some ways worse, right? I'm not trying to blame the slaves. I'm sorry. I hope it didn't sound like I was trying to blame the enslaved. But sometimes how we deal with things increases fear rather than decreasing. It increases the problems rather than solving them in any way.
The Black people have more reason to be afraid of white people, the owners, than what they would have at this point in time. And we, as white people, have because of whatever tales that have ever been told, you know, in our histories, we have been taught to be afraid of Black people.
Right.
So, but how do we get rid of that?
And see, that was the really difficult about this thing. It's easy to see why Black fear is justified because of what we have done, what we continue to do in many ways. But it was very remarkable to me that this chapter on fear was not at all about Black fear. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
It was all about white fear that drove the engine that caused there to be Black fear, but it was white fear that was the base of the problem. And so the primary thing we have to ask is how do we deal with our stuff? What's causing us to continue to be fearful and not solving it? Somebody wanted to say something. No?
Well, I'll bring something up, and that is, in reading the chapter, it reminded me because, you know, when I grew up, the cross was a symbol of substitutionary atonement, but in history, it was a way of controlling through fear.
Uh-huh.
And the same thing with the severed heads of the slaves that had escaped on the stakes.
Yeah.
So we're looking at systemic ways of power, and it's happening between the Palestinians and Israelis right now. And to say that it's systemic doesn't mean that we have no responsibility, but we have to acknowledge that it's more than just individual, that until there's systemic change or ways to bring it, it's going to keep repeating. And it's happened, and that keeps repeating throughout our history.
Yeah.
And actually through human history as well. Because we have crucified Jesus, but we keep on using that power of fear to control others.
Yeah. And much of that fear, both from the Christian side of things and in America from the slavery side of things, is built into how we react to the world. Right? It's just there. And to make it worse, we have that denial of fear, which doesn't even let us acknowledge that that's what's doing the work here. And in fact, we often turn it around and say it's those slaves that should be afraid, not me. When it's really my fear driving the interaction between us. Slave as a slave holder.
And what's the station that the thing fixed? How is it fixed?
Okay. I'll tell you a story that I think helps. Can I?
Sure.
Most of you know I grew up Mormon. Good, strong, big Mormon family. And Mormonism, religion is more akin to the fish, the water around a fish than what it is in like Methodism, which is relatively, it is the environment that you have.
Mhm.
So when I made the choice to leave, told my parents that, the weirdest thing happened. For the next 5 years, they did a good job trying to include me, trying to have me there, but they didn't talk religion around me. Because they didn't want to step on my toes, they didn't want to do whatever it happened to be. That became just a silent subject. Until my brother Richard, who by the way has a very fearful thing happening, he's about to turn 60 years old.
No, it's nothing.
He came up to me and said, I don't even know how to start this, but tell me your story. Tell me why you made the choices you made. And it was the most freeing gift that anyone ever gave to me. It's because he chose to hear me rather than whatever tales he was telling about me, about what the church had said I am or whatever. He chose to come and listen to me. And how many have a bit of a hard time wanting to talk to somebody who's on a different political space than you? It's a difficult thing to do, isn't it? And if you're like most of us, because it's partially based on truth, because you started a conversation with somebody and they have battered you over the head with it. Right?
Or their answer is wrong.
Or their answer is just wrong.
That's wrong.
Yeah. But I want to tell you, the conversation I had with a dear, dear woman. Magnificent person. Brought St. Francis beyond the borders of what was fearful in the 80s and 90s and said, let's us Americans go to Russia. Robbie Dick,
Yeah.
right? Said, let's step towards. And yet she came to me and, you know, after I said something along the lines of, we've got to talk between our political things. And she said, I don't know any Republicans. And she was perfectly serious. She had built her world in such a way that the people she dealt with on a regular basis just weren't that. And many of us do that same type of thing. It's safer to be in a space where everyone is relatively in an agreement space with us. And yet that doesn't really deal with fear. It makes it safer, but it doesn't really deal with fear. And when my brother walked towards me and said, just tell me your story, he had to walk past his fear to do that. Past the whatever he thought was right answers and hear my answer. That doesn't mean that it's an easy path, right? It's a tough thing to move towards some of these things that are fearful. But I do know that if you're afraid of snakes, they will always say, let's slowly move you towards. We are hugely fearful of each other right now, aren't we? With really good reason. Right? And also a lot of reasons that we've built up in our minds that maybe aren't based as much truth or don't have as much power as what we give to them. But it's difficult to figure out what to do with that fear that is standing between us.
I guess I won't talk politics. And I live with these people that the majority of them are Republican. And they really at the dining table to start, and they want me to start in with them. And I just tell them, I said, I don't do that.
Yeah.
Because no matter what you say,
Yeah.
isn't what they want to hear.
I know, and that's the difficult part. When we only though talk to people who do the same thing, and the people at your table are a good example of this. All you do is this is a little bit of a crude thing, is we do political masturbation, right? We're just pleasing ourselves and telling each other the same story over and over again. We're really not challenging ourselves to think about things any longer. We're just staying in a safe place. And what they really need to hear is how you see things differently then, even if they don't agree with it. And you need to, you know, you've probably heard there's too much because it sounds like they're very open in hearing that. But hearing the same side of the story again doesn't make us better. It just confirms a space that may not have all truth. But it's hard to, I understand completely why you don't say anything in that moment, because it's difficult, right?
And it keeps being brought up over and over and over.
I know, but think of it this way. What would happen if enslaved people throughout American history had not stood up and said this is wrong? Somehow the courage that they had to continue to question the rightness of this institution that had become the economic driver of American life. Whoever had that courage is what began to defeat the hold that it had on. And you saw in the chapter many examples of how they were killed because of that.
Yeah, not pretty.
Not pretty. And that's why we don't go that direction. Because it is a fear-invoking space. Do I want to open myself? Do I want to put myself in a vulnerable space too? It doesn't take much imagination, does it?
Mm-mm.
I think a lot of this too, Jen, sometimes deals with not realizing that we are not acknowledging that we are all one. So in other words, there's them over there and us over here, and we're right, they're wrong, and we don't want to come together as one thing, we as one humankind, because then that means I have to acknowledge what you're saying, whether I like it or not, but I have to at least acknowledge it and acknowledge your equal humanity
Yeah.
to my humanity.
And the hard part about that, Deborah, is like the joke I made on Sunday. It's much easier to say, I know God loves me, but still think.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Because we see the reasons why you're not lovable or not worthy of God's attention or whatever. But that's not our theology. It's not their theology either. Right? We believe in a God of love, and it's not a vengeful God that most of us believe in primarily. That enters into some theologies, but primarily it's a God that we profess of love. But we find it hard to live that because of whatever we have against each other, whatever really valid reasons why that other person isn't worthy of, shouldn't have yet.
There's a meditation that my sister sent me that is, how do you love somebody that does not love you? And it's very calming.
Good.
When you go through it.
Yeah, because it's part of what we have to deal with, isn't it? And yet that is the call, I believe, of what this supremely relational God calls us into. And like Deborah said, love and fear are at least one way to view the two is as opposites. You can't have both of those in the same space, right? Love drives out fear and fear drives out love. And if we say this is what we base things on, then somehow we can't just give lip service to having no fear. We have to figure out how to work past the fear.
So if I can bring up something, today I had lunch with retired teachers from Amphi Middle School, and we shared that history. We have different politics, and when the issue of the bank came up, we could agree to disagree and to say that no matter what our political orientation is, ethics has failed, and there's an issue of ethics, an issue that goes beyond. And then to be confessional as well, the person my father was really hard to get along with toward the end of his life because he relied on Fox for his misinformation. And he would come in, I mean, the man that once refused to camp in Texas with somebody who used the N-word and said, we won't let any N-words there. He went on, but later he was echoing all the stuff he heard on Fox about it was the blacks' fault for their own situation. And he believed that Obama he believed in the death panels, even though we participated in one when my mother was ill. So it's a challenge because there's a lot of misinformation out there that people really believe. Like, if you believe that the election was stolen, then it justifies suppressing the votes of others in gerrymandering. And that's the challenge we face. And I don't know if there's any easy answer, except to find some way to see our common humanity and agree to disagree.
And that's really easy to not do if we've told all these stories about who that other person is. You know, what that other group is. The more we've said that anybody like this is, and we put whatever kind of label we put on that, the easier it is to live as if that's a truth, even though it may have no truth at all. I mean, I think, again, that the South, no, I shouldn't blame just the South. The whole of America was so driven by economic, the driver of slavery, that they continue to do what was not even necessarily what they believed in because of the benefits they got out of it. And so they couldn't easily do the hard work of solving that. I mean, we're not gonna survive this era if we don't do something to solve the problems that are here now. We're not gonna win if either side alone moves forward.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that you said that really is the problem. We run so much on what we've been told. Whereas if we sit down and we get to know somebody, you can say anything you want about me, but it may or may not be true, but talk to me. If you want to know the truth, talk to me. And it's the same thing when we're looking at anybody, whether it's somebody who happens to be Black or Asian or Mexican. I'm always taken back to the line that says, how can you say you love God who you have never seen and hate your neighbor who you see every day? And that to me is the root of this entire chapter.
Yeah.
We're hating a large group of people that we know absolutely nothing about except what we've been told. And I agree with Ron, it's endemic in the United States because we run on that constantly. Blacks are bad, blacks are criminals, blacks are violent, blacks are, the list is endless.
And Seth, we use that. So on Sunday, I talked about the number of bills that are out there that are anti-drag queen bills. Why? Because that's such a small population, they can't fight back in a very.
Want to bet? Do y'all remember Stonewall?
Yeah. No, but what I'm saying is it's really easy to say they're the ones to blame for everything. And that's patently ludicrous. But it's relatively a very simple, non-threatening stance to take.
It's a distraction.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right, Seth, that the key to it is stepping towards. If I think drag queens are the problem, I need to step towards a drag queen and talk to that person. And by just making them the enemy, that means that the last thing I'm going to do is actually step towards that relationship, because I've turned them into the very poison that I don't want to have at all. So I'm not going to heal that. And we do that in larger and larger extents, to between Republicans and Democrats, between the United Methodist Church and the Global Methodist Church, right? Whatever it happens to be. And we say that if we just separate from each other, we'll solve things. You want to know what's really scary right now? Is at least one of the things leading up to the Civil War, because we've passed quite a number of benchmarks that are very similar to the benchmarks that were passed in the century leading up to the Civil War. The latest is that the Methodist Church in America split somewhere in the 10 years leading up to the Civil War, split north and south. The Baptist Church as well, Southern Baptist, Northern Baptist. The churches split over the issue, and that then continued the split in America. So now we've come to that spot. 10 years down the road, will we take the next step and have civil war? Or is there something that we can do to retard this momentum we have going in a certain direction?
But it seems like that's so much easier, and I don't speak for myself, but it's the Fox News example of where people, they want someone to blame.
Yeah.
They have to have someone to blame. It can't, and it's a funny phrase, but it has to be black or white. And when in reality, it's really incredibly gray and complex. And a lot of people don't want to put the work out that has to be done to be able to take the step toward each other and listen. They don't want to do that.
Black and white world is much simpler. I don't believe that any of us live in a black and white world. We live in colorful world.
Mm.
And how do you say that an orange is better than a blue? You know?
Well, because it is.
But part of that is situational, Seth. An orange can be better than a blue, but on the other, a blue can be better than an orange. Depending on what it is that you're looking at and what's the setting that it's in. And if we turn it into this is always true, a black and white type of answer, then we fail to be in the conversation about why it is that you like the orange pan and I like the blue pan.
Right.
There's something about the handle that I like, so there's something about the way it heats or whatever. And unless we talk about it, we don't know why we choose differently.
We also have to come to these conversations honestly, in terms of in that I want to have a conversation with you. So I'm going to work on dropping my preconceived ideas, because oftentimes what I see is, okay, I want to hear what you have to say, but you must go through the filters. He can't see, but I'm just here. But you have to go through the filters of what I believe to be right first.
Yeah.
And that's almost an impossible conversation to have.
Almost.
It's almost pointless because you're screening it so much.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of times people want to be all, they want to justify their feelings of anger. They want to hold on to that. It's like, I mean, we see this in the church office all the time, where somebody will get upset about something the church did or didn't do or whatever. But instead of coming to talk to us about it so that we can fix it or at least try to learn from each other, they're happy to tell everybody else about their discontent, but they're not willing to work it out. And I see that it's like, you see that all the time in life. It's like they're more happy to be discontent and hold on to that to justify that than they are to try and work it out. It's like that just takes too much.
But how much of that, Melissa, it's a matter of degree, so I'm not saying that it's exactly the same thing, but how much of it is the same thing that happens in black-white relations in America, that for the longest time, the slave owners, slave holders said they're lesser people and gave themselves justification for doing it. How much of it, when we don't truly step towards the relationship, we're essentially saying that other person doesn't deserve a full place in this conversation.
Because that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of emotional work. It takes a lot of being willing to open yourself up to something that you might be really afraid of. There's that fear-based thing.
Yeah.
And I think that might be a big part of it.
And Lord knows there's reasons why anybody who was owning another human being should be fearful about that, what that person might do. Because if you're not giving complete rights to them, why wouldn't they at some point violently break out of that prison that you set them in order to get what they feel they deserve? So there's some basis of fear, but clamping down harder doesn't take care of that fear.
Right, yeah.
You have to somehow move towards where you come to accept them as equal human beings as you. But that means you have to deal with things like, oh, I'm not paying you very well.
Right.
Or I'm not paying you anything. I'm giving you a house to sleep in, but not much more than that. Right?
Yeah, they couldn't justify owning these people, abusing these people, you know, clamping down on them if they thought to look at them as anything other than lesser beings. They had to be,
exactly,
you know, totally unable to help themselves. They were, you know, they were lower than we were. So they had to look at it that way, because to do otherwise would have the whole system would have, had to change.
And in corporate America, how much does that describe just you're only a profit base, not a real human being? So I don't
Mhm.
care what is truly yours, only how it affects my bottom line.
Right, exactly. I mean,
And
it goes on.
yeah, and yet that type of profit-based theology, that's not the right word, profit-based mentality is drives a whole lot of decisions in America.
Yeah, we call that largely greed.
Largely, that's exactly.
Yep.
And greed is much simpler. And what's the fear behind greed? That I'm not going to have enough money. But you don't describe it that way. You say, "Oh, I'm ambitious. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm doing things that are driving the American economic engine." Instead of saying you're afraid that you won't have enough money to buy food for your family, or to buy whatever else you wanted to have.
So let me bring this up. I mean, for 18 years, I worked with someone who was very, very neat, and I'm not. And we worked out because we worked out in evils, and I didn't hold my position of authority over her, and we didn't make each other bad for what we were. We agreed, we found compromise. But there is a systemic injustice in here, and I'm thinking of when the fire hoses were turned on the children in 1963, or the bombing, or the Bloody Sun, the people's conscience was finally pricked, and people saw that the injustice existed. And then, unfortunately, 2 or 3 years later, if you've ever read Nixon Land, it's a social history between 1966 and 1968 to show how the white backlash happened. And how do we, because there are a lot of people who swear. In fact, if you've read Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochstetter about the Tea Party, they honestly believe in this myth that these people are waiting in line to get in the middle class, and the immigrants and the blacks and Hispanics and everyone else and the gay and trans are stepping out in front of them. Yeah. And they can't. It's a story that's using to divide, but people really believe in it. And how do we? There are times when we see the humanity in the other, the Southern Baptist mother whose son wanted to be a girl, and he became suicidal, and she finally came up and saw what happened. But that story, unfortunately, the story that we have about trans being evil, or that still persists. And how do we address the systemic belief?
Sure.
That's so hard to change.
For example, Ron, why Southern Baptist typical response, this is a broad generalization, is to reject your child, right? And you know why that is? It's easier. You don't have to deal with that anomaly in your life. You just chase them out of the house. You don't deal with them. You reject them as a child. Is that, though, what God truly calls us to do, to reject each other?
No.
Right? So I have let me see if I can describe her correctly. My oldest nephew is named Matthew. His wife is Christy. Christy is mad at all Mexicans. Native Texan, she lives in the Dallas area. So anybody of Hispanic descent, she is mad at them all. You know why? She has a really good friend who was killed by someone who crossed the border illegally. I get it. That's a tough story to hear. It's a tough story to live. But it doesn't mean that that Jose next door is also that type of person. But it's easier to make that broad type of statement and say all of them are, rather than take the more challenging relational space. And I say that because my task has been to try to be in conversation with her when she is a pain in the ass, because that blocks her ability to be in good conversation.
Mhm.
Right? She thinks that all people of Mexican descent are criminals. And I can show her statistics that say that the incidence, statistically of the white crime is higher than Hispanic crime in Texas. But that goes against the narrative she has in her head. And those narratives we hold and carry are really difficult to let go of. Right? Because they give us a certain comfort, a certain stability in the world, even if it is at someone else's expense.
Yeah, Steph just brought something up to me. We, do that with color, but I got caught in the thing of, I was raised in a small fundamentalist Church of Christ. And it was, I look back on it now and the things that they told me, that they're just horrific.
Yep.
And so for me, if you were Church of Christ, I would walk across the street to avoid you. I forbade my children to even going to a family church picnic at a Church of Christ in another town because of the lousy Church of Christ that I went to. And I had to learn that not all those people are bad.
Yeah.
That it was tough, man. I did not want to let that go. I wouldn't darken the door of a Church of Christ again.
Yeah.
But then my grandmother died, and now what do I do? But yeah, it was a narrative that hung with me for years and years.
And it's easy to hold on to narratives, isn't it?
Yeah, it was much easier than trying to work through the hurt.
Yeah. Because stepping into relationship, stepping towards somebody, and if you've ever tried to have a conversation with somebody who is pretty die-hard conservative, it's hard to have a real conversation with them. Because they are convinced of a certain truth and really, from my perspective, don't seem to want to hear much beyond that. But I think they sometimes think the same about me.
Yeah.
And I can't fix what they do, but I can try to be better conversation than what I think their view of me is. But it means I have to work really hard. But in all these things we have to. I mean, we've had 500 years of doing, 400 years of doing black-white relations wrong in America. It doesn't heal overnight, but it does heal if we don't start having some of these really hard conversations. Definitely doesn't fix itself at all if we fall back on old narratives and refuse to think of anything else than that.
I'm just wondering about safe spaces. I'm thinking of a time with someplace in the Midwest on a bike trip, and it was a very small restaurant, and there was a couple there, and the man announced himself as a mean fundamentalist. But we talked just, I didn't go right away and challenge, how can you defend this? We just talked about other things. And it was a safe place to do so. And he wasn't trying, if he wasn't trying to save my soul, and I wasn't trying to correct him or challenge him. And can we find ways in safe places where people can talk and just, I guess, agree to disagree without having to.
Yeah, and be in relationship whether or not we do disagree. Can I tell you about my nephew, John? John is my older brother's oldest son. Did you see the story from a week ago or so of the kid who was stopped by Utah police and said, "No, I'm a sovereign citizen, I don't have to listen to you," and they ended up shooting him in his car? Did you see that story?
No.
Okay. So John has done a lot of stuff where he would resonate with being sovereign citizen. I don't have to be beholden to any authority over me. I don't have to listen to that police officer who says something. I don't have to have a valid driver's license. I don't have to. I've had to be in the same family as John, right? And try to figure out what to do. I don't try to fix John. That's not the first person I'm going to go to if I'm going to try to have a conversation healing some of the divisions between us. What I do have to do with him is be in some kind of relationship. We are family. He is my nephew. And can I have conversation with him that maybe isn't trying to solve the obvious dysfunctions of who he is, from my perspective, but can we still be family? And I feel like some of the times over the last little bit has driven people more and more out of family.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean just the family of origin, I mean
Family.
the church family, the human family, you know, and none of that I think is where we want to go. Trying to figure out how to stay in relationship is the very essence of the spiritual life for me. And it's a hard thing to do, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't start with John, you start with his dad. My brother Milo is a nice guy. I like Milo a lot. So I stay in relationship with Milo and let him try to deal with his son. How about you? Where is it that you find places, not the hard places, but where is it that you're beginning to have those kinds of conversations? Who have you found that you can have some of those conversations across divisions with?
Well, I have conservatives in my family,
Well,
and
Oklahoma.
I even would say I have conservative friends who label themselves that way. And I have found that, it's like what Ron was saying about misinformation. It's very difficult for me to be in conversation with someone who is filled with misinformation. But when they are able to intelligently express their conservative views, I can find that I agree with someone. But they're not Nazis, right? They're not white supremacists. And I would find that very difficult if I was and thank God there's not a white supremacist in my family. Not to say that there's not prejudice. There is prejudice, of course, but not extreme, not someone who wants to build an oven and kill Black children or of any race. And I think that's where I have my limitations. If you're going to go extreme and be filled with misinformation, then I do find it tiring, I guess. But I have found I can fall back on listening.
Yeah.
I can listen and hear their views and suppress my impulse to correct them. Like, let me tell you what the truth is. Because it's useless, right? It can be in some certain circumstances. But I do find it interesting to be challenged with whatever my liberal ideas are, for someone to explain intelligently what they believe in, then I can find truth there.
All of us like to be listened to, don't we? And I'm glad you addressed labels, because anytime we put a label on someone, whether it's correct or not, it also is a way of limiting our ability to listen to them. You know, if all I see is a room full of white nationalists, it makes it really difficult for me to have any kind of buy-in into the listening process with them. Right? Anybody else? Where are you dealing with it?
Well, I found that my family is very, very, I'm
Not you.
I'm the black sheep, but my brother-in-law and I can sit, and it's a safer place for both of us to sit and talk about these things than if I'm with, like, my sister, my mom, or my dad. And we can sit and talk for hours because like Patty was saying, articulates what his concerns are. And he's not out there on the fringe someplace. And when we begin to talk and he tells me what the real concern is, there's usually a point where I can say, okay, I can see that. And then we can go back and forth from there. And that's become my safe place. And it's kind of my way I also use to kind of get ideas in, that I'm not getting shot down before I even finish the sentence.
Yeah. Keep trying to have those kinds of conversations. I'm sorry that it's challenging. I'm sorry it's difficult. I'm sorry that your family are those kinds of people. Because I got some too. But
We've all got those kinds of.
sure.
Yeah.
But what we don't want to do is what we sometimes blame other people doing, and saying, God loves me, but not you. And we want to sit in a space where we can truly be a God that is a universal lover of who we are. Right? And that's really hard to do when people sit in very different spaces.
Well, at least speaking for myself, my only solution to problem with years and years and years, probably the entire lifetime of my life of working and living with my mother, was at some point in time, all of a sudden, the idea of arguing with him because it was going to go nowhere, and I never could get it past my thought. I could never make him understand the right way. And I finally had to decide that this is a stranger that I would know maybe at church or at work. I have to be nice to this person because of whatever. But they don't have to be right. They don't have to insert their ideas in my thought.
They don't have to be your inner circle.
Yeah, and it doesn't have,
Yeah.
and so it would have to be, it could be somebody that I would know and just sort of be there, and this is sort of a friend, and it's okay. I can just hold them out at arm's length. And what's really funny is because the other day, my brother and I had kind of a same type of conversation. We're going to this area that you can understand that, both people in my family were in the wrong thought process. But my brother was obviously in wrong in thinking and in what he was thinking. And I finally, it just came on me that my brother is her son's son. It's one and the same, it's the same family.
Yeah.
And it's not gonna make any change. It doesn't do any good. And just shut up and just don't go in those directions.
So
stay away from it.
So we've run out of time. It's keep thinking along these lines. Keep being brave in these efforts. Fear drives a lot in America, and somehow we have to admit to the fear we have, sit in the space of where other people have fear but aren't admitting it, but somehow continue to be in the conversations, the relationships. Relationships is what will heal this. It's just hard work to be in those relationships. But keep that work up, okay? Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, let's,
Take
Good
care.
night.
night,
night.
Melissa.